evening, everyone, and thank you for your contributions so far and your attention. Maybe we can go immediately to the next slide, please. So I will talk to you a little bit about what it's like for a company like IKEA to find a position or to try to find a position around a topic like the paternity leave. So how do we go about this as a company? When do we take a stand in an initiative or a public referendum? So what we did in this instance is that we were approached by the initiative committee, I think a couple of years back, my predecessor actually, and he brought up this topic. He brought it to our attention. And what we then did is that we looked at what do we as IKEA have in place on a global level? What's our opinion on, I call it BHR principles, but it's also the UN guiding principles in that area. So we knew that we had an opinion there, and what are the main asks of the initiative and how does that go together? So can we kind of come to an agreement there, and is it overlapping? And what we did back in 2018 was that we wrote a letter to Parliament when the counter proposals were going back and forth between the two chambers, and we then stated our support for binding principles because we said we think that voluntary measures are not enough. If you could go to the next slide. But we also know that the Konzernverantwortungsinitiative goes a bit beyond these principles in that it really fixes the due diligence into becoming national law on the one hand, and on the other hand is that controlled liabilities abroad, if they do not comply or if they breach certain human rights and environmental standards, they can be held accountable, or their mother can be held accountable. I think what's important to understand here is that, so based on this assumption, we formulated the position because as IKEA Switzerland, we are I have to go a little bit into our corporate setup. So there's a franchisor who owns the brand and also the whole supply chain. They are the franchisor, and we are part of a franchisee who many other European countries, or I think all where there is an IKEA, are also part of. We are a sales organization, so we don't have suppliers abroad directly, but our franchisor. So that's why it was very important for us not to work in isolation on this and say, yes, we support this, or no, we don't support this, but to have different entities of our corporation on board to come to a conclusion. Next slide, please. So and I think here, maybe I can say a little bit about what challenges are as an international company with people who are maybe not so familiar with the Swiss political system and the topic, what the challenges were. So in general, as we also heard from Samuel and Silvan, they interpret the initiative differently. So there's some gray areas there always when it comes to initiative, because how it will be implemented is up to Parliament. So that might be manageable for us being in Switzerland because we know a bit, or we have a certain idea about the counter proposals that were being discussed in the National Council, or also about the composition of Parliament and so on, but we still have to make some assumptions. If we need to explain that to some colleagues in Sweden that are maybe not so close to the topic, to have them all agree to something has proved to be a bit of a challenge. So challenge one, gray area of initiatives. The second challenge is also how elaborate, I would say, the position on a given topic is. So, for example, we have very clear positions when it comes to reducing CO2. We have a goal to be carbon positive by 2030, so not to emit more CO2 into the emission than we generate O2. or we also have very concrete goals in the area of equality, for example. At the same time, in this area, when it comes to responsible business, we had this overarching, we want to be compliant with the UN guiding principles, but we also have very strict rules on how we work with suppliers. So we have very high standards in place there. But for a company as a whole, to kind of make the link between this initiative and what we are standing for, proved to be a bit of a challenge. Also in times of a global pandemic, we have found that, let's say, the ask from Switzerland maybe was not heard with, I mean, they were very interested in it, but then at the same time, they could not come to a position, or we. Next slide, please. And then, this is what I mentioned before, that the implications go far beyond IKEA Switzerland. We cannot decide this in isolation. We are a sales organization here, but the whole supply chain sits elsewhere. So there it was very clear that, for example, in a topic like in paternity leave, we can say, okay, we stand up for equality, and the whole supply chain doesn't have anything to do with that, and we can come forward and support that. However, when it comes to such a topic that covers really the whole corporation, we need everyone on board, and that proved to be difficult. And I think last but not least, the last challenge was also that it's sometimes hard to for people or companies to see that taking a stance is worthwhile. So I very much welcome entrepreneurs and companies taking a stance in the public discourse, because I feel that in particular in the times we live in, people also should be looking at companies to see what they're doing for guidance. Also, if you look at what has happened in the US this year with all the demonstrations around Black Lives Matter, where there were a lot of companies really taking a stance in this regard, because they would feel the pressure, I think, from the consumers end. And I think that, especially young consumers, we see that in our surveys, are increasingly demanding that from companies. They don't just want good products, but they also want answers in other areas. So to the last slide. I think we can say for this topic, the decision process with different entities in IKEA and maybe also in other companies, and the scope of the initiative made it difficult to kind of find a clear position. At the same time, I am confident and convinced that in topics where companies already have existing positions, for example, in CO2 emission legislation or greenhouse gas emissions, where we also see a lot of companies coming forward, also international ones where they have very clear ambitions, that these companies will not be shy to step up and speak out in public. So with that, back to Sam.